Morning all, congratulations to Natalia Pogonina. She is now the Russian women's superfinal champion. The tournament's complete. She finished a point clear of the field. Let's have a look at another game with black, where she was keen to fight even with black pieces, this time against Girya 2-4 3-3. Natalia is only slightly higher rated at the moment, 2-4-4-8. After d4 we saw knight f6, after c4 e6, but white now plays knight f3. And we get a transposition now into the Queen's Gambit declined territory with d5. White plays knight c3, and now bishop e7, bishop g5, and we have a standard Queen's Gambit declined position. Okay, black castles, white plays e3. It looks very logical set up for both sides. Kind of arm wrestling around d5. This bishop pin looks as though it could be useful for executing bishop f6 at some point, at the most appropriate point for maximum pain to black. When will that be? That's one question. Black doesn't usually want to release the tension here to develop white's pieces and give white the centre. So how is d5 going to be reinforced? And what about this bishop problem? How is that sorted out? Okay, Natalia plays h6 here, and bishop h4 is played, just keeping the tension, not playing bishop f6 for the moment. And now b6, so the bishop is heading for b7, Tartakower defense territory. Rook b1 is played now, so not developing this bishop for the moment. And okay, so what's happening here after bishop b7? Now the bishop's being committed behind that pawn. White seizes the opportunity now to execute bishop takes f6. So bishop takes f6 played here. Losing that dark square bishop would seem a little bit controversial, but on the other hand, what scope is there for the bishop after bishop takes f6? White has a very solid pawn chain here on the dark squares, and now aims to fix this bishop behind the d5 pawn with c takes d. Now it's been committed, it can't waste time that much, can it, to go back, or can it? E takes d5 is played here, and now it looks as though black might be wanting to play c5, which would help liberate the bishop on the diagonal. So this next move seems fairly logical actually, to prevent black freeing position with c5. To play b4, which makes sense of rook b1 of course as well. And the loose bishop here, this pawn would be lost if c5 is just taking, no recapture. There's that b7 bishop. So c6 here. So has white won the opening battle or obtained a small advantage? Queen b3 now looks as though white might be keen on playing b5 later. Bishop c8. Okay, the bishop goes back to that diagonal now. And now b5 hitting black's pawn chain hard, it seems. Bishop e6. Bishop helping to reinforce d5 now. Okay. It seems actually if, well, there's no real option here if c5, d5 would drop. So now b takes c6, undermining the pawn chain, seems logical. But after knight takes c6, it does give black potentially possibilities of knight a5, and maybe knight c4 or the c file potentially. Queen a4, and the knight doesn't move yet, instead it's protected with rook c8, which is indirectly, it seems to be threatening knight takes d4 to hit the c3 knight. That's given support with rook c1, and there might be a potential light square problem here with moves like bishop a6, bishop b5, knight b5. These look a bit menacing, so for the moment the knight gets out of the way on a5, and we still see bishop a6 though, so it looks a bit menacing white's control at the moment of the c-file. If white can connect rooks and try and get that c-file, it would be a significant advantage. So he plays rook c7 here, and then we see knight d2. So knight d2, the knight might be heading for b3 to get rid of the a5 knight here, or alternatively it's ruling out knight c4s from black as well. Okay, bishop e7, white castles, bishop d6, pointing at h2 rather cheekily. White plays knight b5, and then we see rook takes, and bishop b8. So the bishop parks on b8, protecting a7 against that knight. So at the moment there's no significant entry points here, it seems. Queen c2, and now queen d7 is played. And Girya plays now knight c7, which, okay, it gives possibilities of taking this bishop, and maybe something interesting after, maybe something like bishop c8 might be useful at some point as well. Natalia reacts with queen d6, so the knight can't move at the moment because of this battery now. g3 to reinforce h2. Bishop h3, the bishop gets out of the way of any knight takes e6. Knight b5, and then queen d7 again. Okay, the queen can glide now on the knight squares, potentially, if it wasn't protected. Okay, so knight c3, bishop e6. A lot of manoeuvring in this game, but is this bishop going to be good one day? That's a big question here. Knight e2 is played, which seems to imply knight f4. There's an interest in knight f4. Bishop f5, hitting the queen, queen moves. Bishop g4, and knight now goes to f4. So the question is this bishop, was it better than this bishop? Is it worth giving it up, or is it double-edged? It is given up here. It does exert pressure on d5 after all. Okay, bishop takes e takes, which means also maybe the e file can be used for white at some point. Or can it be used by black? Rook e8. Okay, knight f1, and it looks as though e3 might be good to hit d5, as well as put pressure on the bishop. Knight c4 though, a surprise move, knight c4. So that puts a dampener on the e3 plan, knight e3 plan. A very interesting move, offering a pawn, and it gets pressure, and it actually potentially liberates the bishop, of course, if this is taken. Now I think white may have blundered with this move, bishop takes c4. Let's see an engine evaluation on this position. It seems black might be technically better here. In fact, bishop c4 is given as one of the better moves. If rook b1, for example, queen e6 or queen f5, it seems black's doing very well technically. So the engine really likes black's position here. So bishop c4, okay. So is white going to be given the chance for knight e3? Well, it's getting a bit tricky. Queen takes c4 now, and now bishop e6. And all of a sudden, this bishop is actually looking at light squares here, potentially around the king. And then something like queen h3 could be pretty nasty. Queen a6. Okay, now in this position, it's not really probably that effective to play bishop d5. There's always knight e3, it protects g2 as well as hitting d5. So here actually, queen d4 is played. There's a question here, why didn't white leave d4 protected? Let's just check here. Worried about a2 maybe? Seems queen a6 again is an engine recommended move here. If something like queen d3, then just taking the pawn, 2-0 pawn majority is always pretty good as a general rule. And the bishop would go back. So I wanted to protect maybe the a2 pawn here, so offering d4. And it seems here white goes wrong now with queen a7 quite significantly. So let's stop the engine there. In this position, it's tempting to win a7. Apparently it's a slight mistake. Okay, let's go with it though. Queen a7. So what happens now? It's time for bishop d5. So black now controls this file and has menacing threats on the horizon, like queen e4, queen g2. So white plays queen a3 here, wanting to be able to play the defensive f3 on this queen e4 threat. Queen e4 is played at f3. We see check, Then we see the use of that e-file check, and the king doesn't look too healthy now at all. If king h1, queen f2 looks pretty dangerous. Black is really dominating the position. Check, check. The end is near, one suspects. Bishop e6, check. Okay, knight g3, attacking the rook. Rook goes to e3, and now we see quite a few threats emerging here. For example, h5 would seem to be a threat. If knight takes h5, then maybe queen takes g4 is mates because of the pin. Let's just check that out. For example, something like this shows white's in a bad state here. So this knight cannot really leave that position. In this position, white played rook g1, which indirectly basically defends g4 against such a tactic. But then g6, just preparing simply h5. It's pretty desperate. Knight f1, rook e1, hitting the rook. That's all white needs. Loose pieces as well. King g2, check. After king h1, now bishop d5, hitting the queen and f3. It's rather crushing. You might think, well, hang on. In this final position where white resigned here, you might think, what about queen a3? Let's have a look. Queen a3. I would imagine queen f2 here is looking pretty strong, just threatening bishop f3. It looks crushing enough. Just engine check that. It's a sanity check. So queen a3, queen f2 is pretty crushing. Rook g3 just gives up the knight. It's pretty hopeless. So if we go back, actually, let's go back to this position. Instead of queen a7, which allowed bishop d5, knight e3 was maybe offering better resistance. In this position, equal on pawns, bishop h3 and queen e2. Okay, it looks as though the advantage might not be huge here for black. It's a technical move here using the pin. It looks as though the advantage isn't huge. What really happened after queen takes a7, which made this really terrible, is this bishop d5 really introducing these threats of queen e4. If knight e3 here, I think the point is it can be zapped. Rook takes e3. Okay. And let's if it's taken, then c1 drops. It'll be mating as well. This is hopeless. So allowing this bishop d5 really makes white's position creak here, it seems. So that's why this was the last chance saloon, I think, for knight e3 to be played in this position. Knight e3. Okay, let's go back and do a quick overview of this game. So the queen's gambit declined. White gave up the bishop pair and tried to make sure c5 was not playable. When black played c6 now, it seems the pawn chain was subject to attack. There seems to be a little bit of pressure on the queen side. This bishop rerouting onto the dark squares basically caused light square weaknesses, which this bishop then took the baton later to go onto those light squares. So one bishop really is helping the other's cause. So creating basically those light square weaknesses, and then later the dark square bishop gives itself up, and the future of the g4 bishop is helped with this pawn sack with knight c4, creating all sorts of threats, and the rook's very conveniently placed for possible sacrifices to break down white's king safety. So it's a very nice game here, an instructive blunder, and it seems actually often in recent British Championship games you would have observed it seems a standard technique to get the queen away from the king. Once the queen is away from the king, the party can really liven up for a king attack. And here he is offering a7. It's tempting maybe to win a pawn, but it's just too slow. Bishop d5 is really a crushing move in this position, because it's not just the fact that queen e4 threatens mate on g2, it's also h1. So that's the real problem as well. But even knight e3 is just futile with rook e3. So okay, so White tried her best, but there's lots of other weaknesses now to exploit in this position. King being brought up, it's not good in this position. This is a very nasty pin. Just needs basically h5 to try and break down White even further. But this is creating, you know, 2 pins, basically adding 2 pins to the position, making h5 a real threat for knight takes and queen g4. So it's a really desperate position, really impossible to defend this, it seems, this position. And a nice finish with bishop d5, really punishing the queen, not just being away from the king, but also a tempo gainer to even further celebrate attacking the king. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.